to this session on building more resilient supply chains using contract intelligence. I am Vivek Bharti, the Vice President of Product Management at Icertis, responsible for building these supply chain applications that give you more resilience. What I'm going to talk about today's session is a brief introduction to contract lifecycle management, more so in context of supply chains, since CLM is seen to be a standalone, disconnected process. It'll be good to see that context. Then I'll talk a little bit about what iCertus thinks constitutes an intelligent supply chain that will serve the purpose of being resilient, of serving the business objectives. Then we look at a couple of case studies where we've utilized technologies like artificial intelligence and blockchain to actually deliver on the promise of intelligent and resilient supply chains. Uh, Finally, we'll have a look at how the solution offering from iCertus for building more resilient supply chains using contract intelligence actually sit very well dovetailed and integrated into the entire Microsoft Technologies ecosystem. So let's get on by, first of all, defining what is resilience, what is meant by supply chain resilience. I think a very simple definition is a supply chain's ability to withstand shocks, absorb disruptions, and absorb that impact, right? So there are two ways in which this could be done. One is, the classical risk management way that you allow or you wait for an adverse event to happen and then some sort of a disaster recovery plan actually kicks in. Uh, Whereas the other method is more proactive, and that's what we preach and that's what we'll talk about, is proactively identifying uh, signals for disruptions which could come in various shapes and sizes and forms and acting upon those. So let's look at how that can be done using the CLM technology and more importantly contract intelligence. So if you really look at it, the way supply chains are intertwined with what's in the contract. First of all, there are two partners who collaborate to write out a contract that is going to be used by them as a reference for framework of rules to supply services or goods and pay for those. Now, once that is done, once the intentions and plans are captured in a contract document, what needs to be done is that we need to provide the supply chain ability to refer to those agreements, those contracts globally across the enterprise at appropriate time. That's very important because at the times what we see is in companies people talking about having signed up something but not having information to the exact term, the exact clauses, the exact languages that is out there in the contract. So it's important to surface these digitized agreements at the right place, right time, and then use the promise of technologies like AI, ML, and blockchain that we'll talk about slightly later uh, to really identify patterns on performance against those assumptions that are written down in the contract or the promises that are made in the contracts and really start uncovering the potential points of failure or early warnings for something that might not be going as per plan, right? So that's very important. That's where technology actually comes in. This technology is important because the traditional systems, the traditional technology of database systems, etc., is not really able to interpret the contract language. It's a natural and very difficult natural language that the contract clauses and terms are really written in. So important to interpret those and then track those, whether those promises made by both parties, both the contracting parties, are being lived up to not. And last but not the least, the risks that are associated with fulfillment. So the moment you notice a trend, can you trigger a process to sort of start addressing that early warning symptom so that the adverse event before it actually happens, one is ready and prepared. And that's what would constitute a resilient supply chain. Rather than recovering very quickly, if you were proactive about it, you would actually be ready and face a disruption at all. So there'll be no disaster recovery, there'll simply be a transition over to an alternate arrangement. So that's what resiliency is all about. That's where contracts and the contract life cycle, right from signing to monitoring, the promises that are made in the contracts through the life cycle actually comes in establishing an intelligent and resilient supply chain. Talking a little bit about what iCertus thinks constitutes intelligent supply chain that would deliver the kind of resiliency that is required in times like the times that we've seen in the last year or so, right? So one of the important things that we see is we've been treating contracts like static documents that are stored away in repositories. The repositories in slightly more advanced organizations are electronic in nature, slightly easier to sort of search through or whatever, but still they continue to be static documents. Whereas our vision of the supply chain is that every transaction in the supply chain and every dollar flowing through the supply chain is actually governed through some term or some clause in the contract. So, is there a way to turn these contract documents, these static documents, into strategic assets which are continuously sort of exchanging information and signals with the business operations or supply chain transactions that are occurring in the normal course of a business day? Uh, the second thing that we feel very, very passionately about in terms of the supply chain and importance of contracting is that your contracts have to lead the way. Simply because, as I mentioned, every dollar into the business or every dollar out of the business, so whether you're talking of the revenue side or the buy side where you're procuring raw materials or services to produce your goods and services, is actually governed by a contract, right? And there are enough instances of the projected savings or full revenue not coming in. It's basically because the full business value that's captured at the time of writing the contracts is actually not adhered to or is not unlocked by adhering to or making sure all promises are fulfilled, right? So we have to unlock the full business value, and that happens by putting contracts in the center of a lot of business transactions. What is meant by that is the data and the promises that are captured in the contract documents must start governing the transactions in your downstream systems, whether it's payment to vendors, whether it's reviewing performance of suppliers, whether it's reviewing your outstandings with customers or cost to do business with a customer. All that has to be governed through contract terms and clauses. Uh, the third thing that I want to mention here, as a part of our vision for intelligent supply chain contracting, is essentially about the agility, the timelines that we talk about, right? So, a lot of the manufacturing world is actually about uh, connected supply chain segments. There's many supply chains, and all of them come together to uh, actually deliver the end product. Think of a car manufacturer or an aircraft manufacturer. It can be thought of as multiple supply chains or in tiers of supply chain. And one of the most difficult pieces between these partners, the time consuming, I would say, process is the contracting process. Uh, because it's not negotiated by two people who are actually handling the business. These are typically negotiated by lawyers and people who are slightly removed from the actual online zone business operations. And hence, it ends up taking more time because that understanding of the real issues takes time to evolve. So, uh, we think that when you're contracting, for supply chain operations, any services or delivery of goods, uh, or establishing a new supplier relationship, we should do it quickly because ultimately any value delayed is value that is actually leaked out. Um, and last, have an ability to garner more diversity in terms of the types of suppliers, the origin of suppliers, uh, who can actually supply the same goods and services. It's not good to be overtly dependent on one geography, one supplier, or one set of supplier, or one type of technology. So create that diversity. And guess what? An intelligent contract management system or a contract intelligence system would actually help you in monitoring this in real time, not just monitoring. If you really have an intelligent system like the ISOTUS system, it can actually impose constraints on when you're contracting, right? When you're awarding contracts, it has the ability to impose contracts if you're not meeting your geographical diversity guidelines, type of supplier diversity guidelines, or share of business is becoming too risky, is not equitable as per some CSR policy that you might actually have. So that's sort of vision of constitutes an intelligent supply chain contracting process, and it's been sort of endorsed, I would say, or agreed upon by some of the leading manufacturing companies of the world. Look at the names out there: Airbus, BASF, Baxter, Daimler. I mean, they're diverse companies, they're iconic brands, they're known for what they do the world over. Uh, But they've chosen to go with this vision to automate their supply chain, to bring in that reliance, resilience into their supply chain using the contract centric paradigm of managing business, using that contract intelligence. Uh, let's just look at a couple of case studies to just drive home the point. Our vision that we were actually talking about and what I explained is the role of contract intelligence in building a resilient supply chain. So I just want to pick up an example since I mentioned Airbus, a flagship, aircraft manufacturer known globally, huge operations, massive supply chain, right? So when they looked at their process and they were looking at transforming their uh, procurement function, one of the things that they found was a bottleneck in their entire scheme of things was their ability to execute contracts quickly. They were a good sourcing organization, they thought, but when they looked at their bottlenecks, it was contracting, and they were not able to decide, where does it fall? Is it legal? Is it the buyers, the category managers? Why is there such a delay in contracting? Even though we are able to negotiate deals faster, we are able to solicit quotations for the contracts, which are on the paradigm of design to value and all the good things that the manufacturers actually want to put in. And one of the reasons, root causes, amongst several others, was that sourcing and contracting were sort of disjointed. Somebody, negotiated a commercial deal, rates, prices, delivery terms, and then they got into negotiating the contract terms and clauses and stuff like that. So they put in a paradigm using the ICI platform of what we like to call contract centric sourcing or contract centric approach to everything, where contracts were at the center. So every negotiation, every term or clause that was redlined or negotiated upon was actually captured in the contract document, and that would actually be converted into an obligation that will be tracked post execution. So this is how they speeded up contracting, the front end of the process, and about 12,000 odd suppliers who were getting into regular relationships, were fulfilling orders regularly. Those relationships were actually streamlined using this contract centric approach. And of course, the then CPO of Airbus was absolutely convinced about this approach, that if the entire supply chain has to work as a best in class kind of supply chain, where every participant in the supply chain, including the lower tiers of the supply chain, have to be held accountable, then contracts have to be put at the center of the entire process. So that was, one sort of front end process that I talked about. Let's look at now the further downstream. What happens after a manufacturer has contracted, for a particular good or commodity to be supplied, right? Most supply chains are multi-tiered supply chains. So let's look at a very simple example around compliance. So there's one thing is about the quality of goods that you receive, which are QA'd and easy to track, the rejections and tests that are available. But there's certain other compliance requirements in a supply chain, which every tier of the supply chain must remain compliant to. So here we look at an example of tracking clauses like labor standards and making sure that no child labor is employed anywhere in the supply chain by the time, let's say, a mineral gets to someone like Daimler from a cobalt mine for their uh, batteries or what have you. So tracking this whole thing is actually based on a concept of making certain parts of the contract, in this manufacturing supply chain public. So this is actually shared on a public-private kind of a blockchain. Only the relevant clauses, terms, portions of the contract are shared. And this then provides the ability to track compliance, report and track compliance. So any non-compliance anywhere in this supply network would actually surface right to the top of the OEM, and corrective action can actually be initiated. So that's the power of technology like blockchain coupled with contract intelligence, uh, deployed in a very typical multi-tier manufacturing supply chain to make sure that we don't fall foul of any of the compliance requirements or regulatory standards in any of the markets that we might actually be operating in. So, having told you, shared that example with you, I just want to sort of end by uh, telling how this whole thing comes together in the Microsoft technologies ecosystem. So, if you really see, the foundational infrastructure is really Azure from Microsoft, and iCertis as a platform is cloud native, Azure native. Actually, we were born in Azure, you could say. So there's this high degree of compatibility and integratability and ability to work together with all the Microsoft products. Uh, let's look at what do we do on top of that. So you've got the iCertis contract intelligence platform running on the Azure cloud. For all the intelligence and the insights that we talked about, we are very tightly integrated with Power BI. Uh, so, and use AI and Power BI together to deliver those insights. Some of those early warning signals, identifying patterns to predict a possible risk or a failure point. So that's where we used utilizing AI and BI. Uh, the second thing that I want to talk about is some of the tools that are in actually use. So Teams is it's especially in the last year or so is fast becoming a de facto standard for collaboration for a lot of companies. So a lot of our collaboration features in the platform are very tightly integrated with Teams. So we are users would be able to seamlessly work across the iCertis UI, Teams, and work in the place of their choice. And same with Office 365. And a particular mention that I want to make here is of or the Word application, because in the contracting world, MS Word is the most popular. For attorneys, lawyers, corporate lawyers, everyone to review language, redline language, exchange, and all that. We've actually integrated this very tightly with the platform, the iCertis Contract Intelligence platform. So much so that lawyers persona of a lawyer reviewing or authoring a contract or doing any of the transactions that they're normally required to do on a contract, uh, they don't need to leave MS Word to utilize all the features of iCertis, of all the intelligence that's there in the iCertis contract intelligence platform. It's all available in the Word UI, in the Word interface. So that's the kind of integration we have with Office 365. Similarly, Microsoft Dynamics for people, manufacturers who might be using it as a ERP or sellers who are using it as a CRM system. Uh, we're tightly integrated. We have out-of-the-box adapters where, let's say, I want to take an example of a CRM scenario where particular lead has moved to a stage where pricing and draft contract has to be submitted to the customer. One click from the Dynamics UI would help you generate a contract from iCertis, which is compliant with all the contracting policies, all the contracting rules that might have been put in place uh, for a given company, and give it back to the sales person who's supposed to submit that proposal and the draft contract. So makes life easier. So there's very tight, I would say, integration between various Microsoft products that you find manufacturing organizations using, and the iCertis contract intelligence platform. So if you really look at the power of this, all of this coming together, it's easy to really take it beyond a one company initiative, because something like the blockchain framework or the example that I gave you, it depends a lot on a community developing. But with an ecosystem of this nature, where you've got very smart contracting capabilities, uh, coupled and tightly integrated with tools of choice, for everyday work that people have uh, in their day-to-day life, if that can deliver easily with ease of use and hardly any change management effort, then it's easy for a community to come up that will subscribe to these blockchain kind of solutions as well, and which are based on Azure and this entire technology stack. So that's where together in a partnership, Certus and Microsoft, we stand with respect to solutions for uh, building resilient, intelligent supply chains for manufacturing organizations. I hope you found that useful. And if that evokes a lot of interest in you, here's some resources to help you. Visit icertis.com. It's rich in content with all the references that I made. You'll find some thought leadership blogs around contract-centric sourcing, contract-centric category management, uh, de-risking your supply chain, how different industries and different manufacturers can benefit from contract intelligence, a lot of case studies, all of that you will actually find there. And uh, if you're pursuing deals or leads out there in the field, um, our sales folks are spread across the US and the world. So get in touch with your nearest one, and they will connect you, to the right resources within iCertis for executing customer demos or any other solution conversations that may actually be required. Hope that was useful. Thank you.